Welcome to Soundblot, the podcast from the International Society of Rorschach and Projective Methods. This is Giselle Hass, and today I have the pleasure to interview Dr. Reneau Kennedy. Dr. Reneau Kennedy is a clinical and forensic psychologist based in Honolulu, Hawaii, and we have the honor of talking with her about the history of the Rorschach and projective methods and psychoanalysis in general in the United States. Dr. Reneau, it's a pleasure to have you. Nice to see you again.
I'm delighted to be here to see you and also to be connected virtually to all of our colleagues all over the world.
Yes, we are so excited about this idea of the podcast because this is something that people can download and just listen to it when they are working out or running or walking or driving. And we think that it is a great idea to really give people these kind of little drops of knowledge and information that will help them to really become better clinicians and to know more about the instrument that we love.
I think that's so important because as the people that are working with instruments, we need to understand contextually about how and why an instrument was created and how it was used and for what purposes. And that by context generates history over time with research and articles and the things that have come to where we are today. So history guides us in very important ways that it's just been so much fun for me to be on the discovery trail and then to have opportunity to share it with people because it's been a passion for me since I think 1992.
1992. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me about your interest in projective performance methods of assessment and your interest since 1992 in this part of its background and history.
Perfect. Well, I was a doctoral student once upon a time, like all of us were, and I was placed in the Harvard Medical School's special program that dealt with individuals who were at a state hospital who were being evaluated for competency, criminal responsibility, and dangerousness. So it was a state facility, and I was learning a lot about psychopathology. But at the same time, while I was learning about psychopathology as my placement or a practicum, I was developing my skill set to go forward to figure out what do I want to do as a dissertation. Long story short, I became fascinated with the opportunity of learning about men who murder. And I spent a lot of time with men who murder. And I thought to myself, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to do a doctoral dissertation where I am able to learn about the functioning of an individual and how they and why they come to the point of deciding to kill. And so I then I was working at a Bridgewater, but also learning from people from the Boston Psychoanalytic Society, as well as people using psychoanalytic and classic methods. And as a result of that, I became enraptured with the Rorschach. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be neat to use projectives to study a group of men who murder? Hence, after a year of waiting for my approval to be gone through by the Department of Corrections, I spent a year immersing myself in Rorschach and Rorschach methods and how I could use it and apply it to this particular population. And it was through that the discovery of history about Rorschach using Exner's method tied to very important things that Samuel Beck had done and the very openings of his first three books. What was interesting and important to me about it was his son, Jim Beck, who is a psychiatrist at Harvard, was a friend and colleague of mine. And I asked him one day about his father's papers, and in particular, his father's work on the henchmen of World War II with Hitler. And he said, "Oh my gosh." He said, "The last 3 years of my father's life before he died was working on those Rorschachs, and they were never published." And that's another story long before that. But we fast forward, and what I got access to was Jim Beck's father, Sam Beck's entire files of Rorschach. But what came out of his files was this. And this is an ink blot that was very, very old. There was no internet at that particular point. It's in old Germany, in old German, and there's
Uh-huh.
writing there. And
Uh-huh.
no one at that time knew what it was. So this letter from 1932
Oh my
came from a
God.
man in England that
Uh-huh.
sent this blot to Sam Beck, saying
Oh,
this blot of over 100 years ago may be of interest to you. No
wow.
identification of what it was. And so I call it, and I'll be presenting in Geneva about it, I call it the first ink blot. I
Yes.
could not figure out, because it looks so much like card 1 and 5 in different
It
sorts of ways.
does.
I
It
was thinking,
does.
where did this come from?
Mm-hmm.
And it was only after about 20 years of treasuring this blot and carrying it all over the world, wherever I lived, to try to find out what its source was. So I've been able to authenticate it, and I've learned a lot about Justinus Kerner, who was a spiritual psychiatrist, was trying to understand the soul. And at the end of his life, he was making these particular types of ink blots, and then he was relating to them and making poems. And
Oh
as
my
a
God.
result of his work in the 1850s, he then produced a series of blots that was subsequently published in a beautiful publication using color, as well as black and white, called Klexography. And that publication occurred at the end of his life. And so it never saw the light of day much, but the history of what he was doing with the ink blots took roots from Germany across the continent into all parts of different folks knowing about it, both in academia, as well as, when we eventually move to Switzerland and start to talk about the team there. But it also traveled across the United States, and there were people actually working with ink blots before the turn of the century here in the United States. And that can be tied over in some ways to a very important visit that Freud and Jung did to the United States in 1908, 1909 at Clark University. So there's lots of stories to tell.
Wow. That's
And so
amazing.
each of those bits and pieces, like the Klexography piece, the Kerner piece, the history of the medical physicians,
Mm-hmm.
literally, who started this whole process, it wasn't psychologists.
Yeah.
But we always have to think about it in context of what was happening and how psychology changed from 1817 to 1917.
Mm-hmm.
And psychology started to take more of a less ideographic approach to trying to understand people both ideographically as well as nomothetically. So,
Mm-hmm.
what we call that time period was dynamic psychology. So, the roots or the richness that was coming out of how Rorschach started to see people was also happening all of the world in science. So we
Yeah.
always have to think about the terra firma to which beautiful ideas are born, of which Rorschach's, as we know, eventuated with, his publication of Psychodiagnostic many years later.
How fascinating. It is incredible that you found all this information that was so less known about all this history, about how the zeitgeist was really promoting people
Yes.
at different levels in different regions to really think about ways of going in depth, let's say, to understand the human mind and to understand the workings of our behavior in functioning. It's amazing how it all came together like that. That's
Yes, and I think what's related to that is we also have to layer history in, because we know with the First World War in 1914, what was happening was a whole movement about people and eugenics.
mhm,
And in fact, eugenics was part of the reason why people were looking at the ink blots in the United States before Rorschach produced his, because at Ellis Island, when they were having to screen people and decided who could stay and who couldn't, multiple languages could not be used. So ink blots were used as a method by a couple of psychologists to try to understand a way of accessing people where language could not be used. And that too is yet another podcast and another story that we can talk about. This movement showed up again when we look at World War II and what was happening with the definition of the superior person versus the inferiors. And hence, we layer onto that the Americans who used the Rorschach to try to understand Hitler's henchmen in the 1930s.
yeah.
So there's so much to think about when we think about the evolution of where a profession is, how history affects it, how people need to access and learn about people, and what our instruments, now we call them instruments, but at that particular point it was called methods, or access to the human to really understand what we're talking about when we're looking at intrapsychic structure and personality functioning.
So that's wonderful. And I'm so excited that ever since 1992, you're still passionate about the Rorschach, you're passionate about the history, and that you want to share because every time you learn more and more that it is fascinating history.
Oh my gosh, I'm jubilant about it. And, when I was, my last opportunity at being at the Society of Personality Assessment, I found a tribe of people that I love working with. And we are a small working group, really passionate about the concept, the method, the history, and the integration of this. And it comes from a wonderful, wonderful kind of blend. And from that, every time we speak, it just sparks everything. And if we think back to the time when Rorschach was starting as a psychiatrist, they weren't publishing papers, so to speak, in journals because they did something different. They were writing papers and they would share them within the analytic society, and then they were starting to publish. But he was sharing his method amongst his colleagues in a similar sort of way where it's not publish or perish, but it's really talking about the integrity of how do we study something, how do we think about it, and then moving forward. So it's the ink blots are such an interesting aspect of the representation of trying to access the soul, if you will, going back to Kerner,
Yeah.
and how we have evolved in doing that. And I think with our centennial, there's a resurgence, at least from my point of view, to make sure that those who are much younger than myself have the opportunity to learn about this fantastic story of
Mhm.
psychology and how the blots have their meaning, to which I've looked at many, many books and thought about many things over the years, but now is the time to share it. And I think through oral history is probably one of the best ways for people to do it, because it's kind of like there's a wonderful children's storybook called Uncle Wiggily. And each night there's a little kind of section about what Uncle Wiggily does. And at the end of the little vignette that was written in the 1930s, it's kind of like, if the cat doesn't tip over the milk, and we don't have a disaster, tomorrow I will tell you about. And so it's just, I love to story tell and I love to share in an area that is now ripe for the opportunity of being able to be in one another's workout rooms or, in a car, sharing a wonderful story about something that has evolved.
And tell our readers, why is it important that we preserve this history? Because as you mentioned, because of the tradition of publish or perish, a lot of people that like to write and that like to publish really are thinking more about what will be publishable, what will be accepted, what is read. And sometimes a lot of this history has gotten stuck or lost because there's very little room or very few places where we can really dedicate the space or the interest to really talk about this part of the history.
Well, I think that that's really important, Giselle, to talk about because I think it's essential that we work with eigenvalues and correlation coefficients and regression analysis. And my little study on murder kind of helped me do that. But that was in the nomothetic. But what I want to know is why in the ideographic does someone do what it is they do?
Mm.
And there and I have used personality measures for my entire career. And it's many different measures, and it's no different if it's the MMPI or the PAI or the Rorschach. It helps me with an understanding of a picture. And so what the Rorschach does for me, especially being somebody who has done hundreds of them, it's my window to the soul that I can read, and I get so much out of a Rorschach that I do not get in any other way. Now, if we were talking to Jim Butcher, he would be talking about MMPI in a certain kind of a way. And I think we all have our instruments. But what I love about the Rorschach is it is a projection of oneself that people are talking about, because all we're looking at is just a little bit of ink.
Yeah.
And what comes from that is something that this person is responding to. So when we think about psychoanalysis and free association, what
Mhm.
we were doing in that particular method, or working with dreams, dream analysis, is bringing out those parts of the person that's not a yes or no or a black and white kind of an answer. It's talking about the gestalt of the individual. And that's where we think about going back of looking at what Freud and Adler were talking about. They were looking at soul work and trying to understand individuals in context to that.
That's fascinating. I
It
am
is.
so excited about this part of the history and how now there's a group of you who really have come to rescue this part of the history, and that hopefully we will preserve it, like you said, in the oral history, that we are going to share it, that we are going to find also about the history of how the Rorschach came to other countries as well. For this
Absolutely.
project, yeah, for this project of the centennial, I took the job of looking into how the Rorschach came to Costa Rica. And
Fabulous.
that was amazing because there was no real history. I had to interview people who remember, when they study with this person who showed them the cards. And at the same time, it came through the medical field that
Exactly.
somebody brought the cars, somebody went to a workshop in the United States, brought the cars, and how it all became really like a like a chain of coincidences of people who were started to bring it at the same time or who worked together. And these groups started to form. When I studied in Costa Rica, um, I studied Rappaport. We didn't have Exner. This was,
Oh,
had
no,
not
way before.
Exner has not arrived in Costa Rica because it was not translated.
No, we're not even to the big five yet. That comes in the 1960s.
Yes, yes. So it's
It's interesting that you say that because as we will talk more later about it, Sam Beck was the first man to publish a dissertation in the United States, and he got that directly from the Swiss folks who were working with Rorschach. But I was looking into his papers, and just for your interest, in 1935, there was a convention where they were doing very interesting work, and they requested for Sam Beck to attend to present Rorschach methods there. So it will be fun to find out what the Bolivia Trail is. We've got Costa
Yes,
Rica, so then we get to find out more from someone who has access to that material and learn about that particular international presentation and who were the people that were very excited about this method.
I am very happy about that. And also, I want to remind you that this is the first of our podcasts that is dedicated to the exploration of this lesser known history of the use of the inkblots, and that we will are very happy to have Reneau help us coordinate this track of podcasts and really go over a lot of these different pieces of information. And one of those is the one that you're presenting in our bulletin, that it is about David Levy
Yes.
and how he was really someone that I never heard of. And he
Yep.
really was the first one who brought it to the United States.
Yes, that's right. And he was the person that taught Sam Beck how to use the method. And well, he taught Marguerite Hertz, and I mean, we can go on and on about the big five later, but he taught Sam Beck the method, and the and he was the one that said, "Why don't you use this for a dissertation?" And he was going back and forth to Switzerland and writing with Oberholzer, Emil Oberholzer, who is the fellow who was a very close colleague of Rorschach's and in the psychoanalytic field. And when Rorschach passed away, his wife asked Emil to take papers, and then Emil finished up what ended up being our first diagnostic. And so Emil was still very excited about it, and there were people traveling across the ocean to learn the method. And David Levy was so excited when he went back after a visit with Oberholzer. They were planning to do these studies, small studies in different parts to see what they could learn about young people who were in juvenile delinquent places, to learn about people in correctional facilities, to learn about different people where there was access, where we had what's called these psychoanalytic or psychology clinics. And so these clinics were starting to do, quote, in quote, research, where they would have access to groups of people where they could start to apply the method that was used then to understand what kind of data can be mined. And then, of course, Sam Beck was so important because he was a statistician in a way. And so, what David Levy was doing as a psychoanalyst, but also as a policy person in charge of children's mental health in New York State, and then subsequently in Chicago, Illinois, working with Alfred Adler's son and others, trying to say what kind of methodology can we use to understand children and children that are in trouble? What are the monikers that we can identify? And hence, the Rorschach just kept coming up and coming up. And so all these studies were starting to be populated. But the richness, from my perspective, is this: the instrument started out with psychiatrists and in a psychoanalytic method of trying to understand human personality. And Rorschach was encouraged by his mentors to be able to go forward with this methodology. Rorschach presented his papers in the psychoanalytic way. And as a result of his work, and Oberholzer, who then followed, who was connected to David Levy, who traveled across the ocean to come and study with him and learn the method, took it back to the United States, and then started to populate an excitement with people in the United States to learn the method. And so Marguerite Hertz is right on the shirt tails of
Yes.
Sam Beck. And
Mhm.
we're talking about 1926, 1927.
Wow. Fascinating. This is a wonderful story. And also to know that there are all these documents, like your picture there, that
Mm.
really also need to be preserved and treasured.
Yeah, I think that's what's so important is to understand when we've got primary source data. It's
Mhm.
not somebody just saying something and it gets republished in another book, and because this person said it, it must be true. What's important to me is to go back to the roots, to the source, just like I had to do to authenticate this first blot and learn as much as I could about Justinus Kerner and then about, his children, his sons, one of whom was a physician who then the two boys worked together to have plexography come together in that very first publication. So the merging of psychiatry, psychoanalysis, this whole dynamic movement merged over with our beginnings of this way in which we're looking at the nomothetic that has brought us a long way to where we are now. And I think it's been wonderful, but I think it's always important to remember, even though we're doing normative comparative data for things, it's always important to think about the human individual we're studying and what particular components can we mine and use with reliability that
Mhm.
teach us about a particular individual and what do people say about it. So
Yes.
just briefly, David Levy was the person that worked very hard on the concept of human movement.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
there's another story to tell about that.
Yes. That's the interesting part is that as we study all this, as we learn about it, we see a lot of threads of really
Beautiful.
important insights that
Yes,
people were interested, but that somehow they got lost. And that now we can really see how really some of them can interact with things we have learned in the
yes.
more modern studies of the Rorschach and the human mind, and really start putting it all together. And that is just fascinating as well.
Yeah, it
Thank
is
you
to
so
me.
much. Thank you so much, Renaud. This has been a fascinating conversation. And I am looking forward to us working together to
Mm.
really bring these drops of knowledge and information to our listeners and to really talk more about it and explore it in different ways.
Me too. And we're going to start in the 1800s.
Yes, that's terrific. Thank you so much for this conversation and have a wonderful day.
You too, Giselle. It's truly a pleasure. And thank you to our listeners because it's a wonderful journey that we are embarking on.